Purposes, gentleman from Michigan seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I would move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3204, the Drug Quality and Security Act.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3204, a bill to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with respect to human drug compounding and drug supply chain security and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask unanimous.
The gentleman will suspend. The House will come to order.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material into the record on the bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 3 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 3204, the Drug Quality and Security Act. I am so proud to say that this piece of legislation is a product of true bipartisan and bicameral work. The Senate and House, Republicans and Democrats, have come together to produce a bill.
The House is not in order. Please take your conversations off the floor. Thank you. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Senate and the House, Republicans and Democrats, came together to produce a bill that will protect American patients by ensuring that they receive safe drugs. This legislation would strengthen the prescription drug supply chain in order to protect American families against counterfeit drugs. The bill also eliminates and prevents increases in drug prices, avoids additional drug shortages, and eliminates hundreds of millions of dollars worth of duplicative government red tape on American businesses that is harming job growth.
Correct. The House is not in order. Please remove conversations off the floor. Please cease conversations on the floor. Again, please remove all conversations from the floor. Please remove from the aisles all conversation before the gentleman can continue. The gentleman will continue.
Mr. Speaker, the supply chain provisions of the Drug Quality and Security Act are the product of many years of tireless work. We know from stakeholders like Pfizer and Perrigo in Michigan that this is just not a patient safety issue, it's a jobs issue. This bill will bring certainty to the drug supply chain and ensure that patients will continue to receive the medicines that they need without interruption. This bill also addresses drug compounding. This bill is the result of Energy and Commerce Committee's thorough investigation of the NECC meningitis outbreak, which began its devastating spread almost a year ago today. To date, the CDC has linked 64 deaths, nearly 750 cases in 20 states, to contaminated drugs from the NECC. My home state of Michigan has been the hardest hit by the outbreak, with 19 lives needlessly lost, with 3 in my district. And the sad truth is that, yes, they could have been prevented. This legislation is an important step in helping to prevent any such tragedy from ever occurring again. And by reviewing countless documents, holding 4 committee hearings, reviewing various legislative proposals, we better understand what is needed to help prevent a future NECC and built that into this legislation. Mr. Speaker, this bill upholds the current Section 503A of the law and provides with clarity that the FDA needs by eliminating the unconstitutional provisions. The bill also requires the FDA to engage in meaningful communication with state boards of pharmacy. Further, under this bill, entities engaged in sterile drug compounding can voluntarily register with the FDA and operate under FDA regulation. And finally and importantly, this bill protects traditional pharmacy compounding that occurs in community pharmacies across the country. That's why the bill has the support of the National Community Pharmacists Association. I'd like to thank them for working with us so closely. I also want to thank Chairman Pitts, Chairman Murphy, Vice Chair Blackburn, Mr. Latta, and particularly Mr. Griffith for their outstanding leadership on these issues. I want to commend Mr. Waxman, Mr. Pallone, Mr. Dingell, Ms. DeGette, Mr. Green, and Mr. Matheson for their work as well. An additional 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional minute.
I also want to thank Chairman Harkin and Senator Alexander for their leadership, and I talked with them a number of times over the last number of weeks. I want to thank our staff on both sides, particularly on our side, Clay Allspaw, Paul Edidell, John Stone, and Carly McWilliams. It is because of their collaborative and tireless efforts that we are near the resolution of last year's deadly outbreak, and their work is to be applauded. To all the families who have lost loved ones and to those who are still suffering today, and I talked to someone whose relative is still suffering just within the last hour, we are near the resolution of last year's deadly outbreak. So let's say to those families and to those who lost loved ones and those who still are suffering today, with this bill we're going to say never again. So I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 3 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I rise to support passage of the Drug Quality and Security Act. It's been a year now since the tragic fungal meningitis outbreak caused by the New England Compounding Center in Massachusetts. At least 64 people died. Over 750 people were sickened. More than 14,000 others are still waiting and must live in fear for years to see whether they, too, will get meningitis. This was the largest outbreak of healthcare-associated infections in U.S. history and one of the nation's worst public health disasters in recent memory. Recognizing the need to act in the face of this tragedy, members on both sides of the aisle in both houses of Congress came together in the months following the outbreak to try to figure out how to solve this problem. One thing was clear: FDA's authority over compounding pharmacies were not up to the task. Divergent court decisions on the underlying statute had forced the agency to cobble together a piecemeal approach to regulating compounding pharmacies that was different in some parts of the country than in others. That untenable legal situation created loopholes that companies like NECC were able to exploit. FDA was also facing a pharmacy compounding industry that had dramatically changed since 1997, the last time Congress passed legislation on this issue. Since that time, hospitals have grown dependent on so-called outsourcers, very large compounding pharmacies that mix batches of customized drugs for hospitals. The legislation we're considering today will take a major step toward addressing these issues. First, it will correct the constitutional defect in the underlying law that has wreaked havoc on FDA's ability to regulate compounders. Second, it will give hospitals and doctors the ability to access a source of compounded medicines that are made in a facility that is subject to stringent FDA quality standards and oversight. All other compounding pharmacies would continue to be subject to current law. Third, the bill will remedy one of the major problems that surface in the NECC situation: a lack of effective communication between state boards of pharmacy and the FDA. Specifically, it will create a system in which state boards of pharmacy and FDA can notify each other when there are concerns about violations occurring at a particular compounding pharmacy. These authorities represent a significant improvement over current law. They will go a long way toward better protecting public health. In addition to these important compounding I yield myself another 30 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for additional 30 seconds.
In addition to these important compounding pharmacy authorities, this legislation will establish an electronic, interoperable system at the federal level that tracks each package of drugs at the unit level and that involves the entire supply chain. This will help prevent Americans from being harmed by counterfeit and substandard medicines. There's no question in my mind that this bill represents a step forward, and I urge all members and of my colleagues to support it. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the Health Subcommittee, Mr. Pitts from Pennsylvania.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased that the House is considering H.R. 3204, the Drug Quality and Security Act, today. this legislation would address two important issues affecting the quality and security of America's drug supply. First, the bill would protect traditional pharmacies and clarify laws related to human drug compounding in response to last year's nationwide meningitis outbreak, one of the largest public health crises in recent memory. Secondly, the bill would strengthen the prescription drug supply chain in order to protect American families against counterfeit drugs. As we all remember, in the summer and fall of 2012, a Massachusetts company, the New England Compounding Center, NECC, shipped over 17,000 vials of an injectable steroid solution from 3 contaminated lots to healthcare facilities across the country. After receiving injections of NECC's contaminated steroid, over 64 people died from complications associated with fungal meningitis, and 750 others were stricken with meningitis or other persistent fungal infections. Title I of H.R. 3204 is based off of Representative Morgan Griffith's Compounding Clarity Act and is the culmination of a nearly year-long House Energy and Commerce Committee investigation. It clarifies FDA's authority over the practice of compounding drugs and requires FDA to engage in dialogue with state regulators to prevent against another tragedy like NECC, while protecting the role of traditional pharmacies in compounding. Title II, based on Representative Bob Latta's Safeguarding America's Pharmaceuticals Act, addresses the safety of our nation's prescription drug supply chain as drugs travel from the manufacturer to the pharmacy. It creates a uniform national standard for drug supply chain security to protect Americans against counterfeit drugs while eliminating needless levels of bureaucracy. The Drug Quality and Security Act is the result of months of bipartisan, bicameral negotiations, and I would like to thank Chairman Upton, Ranking Member Waxman, Chair Emeritus Dingell, Representative Griffith, Latta, Pallone, DeGette, and Green for their work on important legislation, and also Senators Harkin and Alexander in the Senate. And finally, I would like to thank the staff of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee, on our side, especially Clay Alspach, Paul Editol, Carly McWilliams, Heidi Stirrup, and Monica Volante. This bill is supported by PhRMA, the Generic Pharmaceutical Association, the National Community Pharmacists Association, the Healthcare Supply Chain Association, and the Pharmaceutical Distribution Security Alliance, among others. And I would urge all of my colleagues to support this common sense bipartisan legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the ranking member on the Health Subcommittee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Waxman. I want to rise in support of the Drug Quality and Security Act. This bill represents a bipartisan, bicameral effort to clarify current pharmaceutical compounding laws and secure our nation's pharmaceutical drug supply chain. It's the culmination of several months of hard work and tireless negotiations between our committee and the Senate Help Committee. As a result of the terrible tragedy in Massachusetts, the House Energy and Commerce Committee held hearings and engaged with stakeholders and the FDA in order to understand the existing problems and the best options for addressing them. What became clear was the need for patients and providers to have access to safe compounded drugs. This legislation helps ensure that quality compounded drugs are available to patients who need them. This effort also makes clear that FDA's authorities over compounding pharmacies needed to be fixed. A court-split decision over the statute had hampered FDA's ability to effectively enforce their authority over compounding pharmacies and ensure the safety and effectiveness of compounded medications. The bill before us will fix this constitutional flaw by deleting the provisions that were deemed unconstitutional by the courts.
The House is not in order. Gentleman Murray Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The bill will permit compounders who wish to practice outside the scope of traditional pharmacy to register as outsourcing facilities, but those who choose to remain traditional pharmacies will continue to be regulated as they are under current law. And this gives doctors and hospitals the ability to purchase compounded drugs for their patients made in a facility that is subject to stringent FDA quality standards and oversight. In addition, the legislation offers providers and patients better information about compounded drugs by directing FDA to make a list of FDA-regulated outsourcing facilities available and requiring detailing labeling on compounded drugs. It will also improve communications and coordination with FDA and state authorities. Now, the second title of the bill establishes a uniform national drug tracing framework to track prescription drugs from the manufacturer to the pharmacy and raises the standards for prescription drug wholesalers and third-party logistic providers across the U.S. This is the result of several years of work to address the growing problems of pharmaceutical theft, counterfeiting, and diversion. The bill before us today makes significant improvements from the bill that passed the House earlier this year. Most notably, it develops a workable pathway to unit-level interoperable tracing in a decade. And I think we should all be proud of the work our staffs have done. I'd like to thank again Mr. Waxman, Mr. Upton, Chairman Pitts, Mr. Dingell, Ms. DeGette, Mr. Green, Mr. Matheson, Mr. Latta, and Mr. Griffith for their work on this bill. Mr. Speaker, the American people deserve the peace of mind to know that the medicines they take are safe and effective. The Drug Quality and Security Act is a critically important step in protecting the public's health, and I urge members to support this bipartisan, bicameral legislation. I yield back the remainder of my time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Back. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, member of the committee.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of the Drug Quality and Security Act of 2013. Title II of this legislation, Drug Supply Chain Security, is based on H.R. 1919, the Safeguarding America's Pharmaceuticals Act of 2013, which I introduced along with Congressman Matheson. H.R. 1919 was passed on the floor by a voice vote on June the 3rd of this year. Title II of this bill relates to the drug supply chain, and I am pleased that a bipartisan, bicameral agreement was reached to secure our drug supply chain and protect patients. Securing our nation's pharmaceutical supply chain is extremely important, and passage of this bill is an important step forward to protecting America's families. Pharmaceutical distribution occurs nationwide, and it is estimated that within the United States there are more than 4 billion prescriptions filled each year. By replacing the current patchwork of multiple state laws with a uniform national standard, we're improving safety, eliminating duplicative regulations, and creating certainty for all members of the pharmaceutical supply chain. When anyone takes a prescribed medication, he or she should have a full confidence that the medication is as prescribed and that no counterfeit or adulterated drug has entered the supply chain. To protect patient safety, the bill creates a uniform national standard for securing the drugs distribution supply chain, therefore preventing duplicative state and federal requirements relating to tracing. No state can impose additional and inconsistent regulations related to tracing products on the supply chain members. The bill increases security of the supply chain by establishing tracing requirements for manufacturers, wholesale distributors, pharmacies, and repackagers based on the changes in ownership. The bill also establishes a collaborative, transparent process between the FDA and stakeholders to study ways to even further secure the drug supply chain through public meetings and pilot projects. I was successful in including language in the FDA user fee law to allow hospital systems to repackage drugs within a hospital system in the instance.
30 more seconds.
30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for 30 additional seconds.
Thank you very much. Within a hospital system in the instance of a drug shortage. I will continue working with the hospital systems on the issue of permitting these systems to prepare batches of compounded drugs in advance of the specific physician prescription or order. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank especially Chairman Upton and Subcommittee Chairman Pitts for all their assistance in advancing this legislation. I want to thank the Health Committee staff and especially my Legislative Director, Allison Witt, for all their hard work. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would urge full support of H.R. 3204, and at this time I yield back. Thank you.
Members are advised not to traffic the well. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the Chairman Emeritus of our committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized. Without objection.
Speaker, this is a good bill. It's not perfect, but it is a huge stride forward. It represents a major step in securing our pharmaceutical supply chain, improving FDA's authority to oversee compounding pharmacies. It also is done under a bipartisan, bicameral, cooperative, and enthusiastic effort by members on both sides of the aisle and on the Capitol working together. It addresses the problems of the deadly fungus meningitis outbreak of several years ago, which were traced to lots of supposedly steroid injections made at the New England Compounding Center. There were 264 cases of fungal meningitis in my home state and 19 deaths. This will address that concern in a very excellent way. It also sees to it that FDA and the states are able to cooperate together, have better funding, and more authority over compounding pharmacies. It also does something else which is very important. It sees to it that now we can track and trace pharmaceuticals through the channels of trade, a very, very important need. And it is for the first time going to see to it that Americans are able to address their concerns about the safety of pharmaceuticals in these important areas. I want to thank Chairman Upton for his leadership, Ranking Member Waxman, Representatives Pallone, Matheson, DeGette, and Latta and Pitts and Griffiths, and my good friend Mr. Green for their hard work on this legislation. I hope that we can quickly send this legislation to the President's desk for signature. And now just one thought. Why is it that on legislation of this kind, this body can work together and we are not capable of dealing with massive problems like government shutdown and dealing with continuing resolution? Perhaps maybe a little bit of informed, intelligent behavior by this House on other matters would be in order.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, I would yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, who played a very large part on the compounding side of this legislation. 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr.
Excuse me. The gentleman suspend. The chair will remind all persons in the gallery that they are here as guests of the House, and that any manifestation of approval or disapproval of proceedings or other audible conversation is in violation of the rules of the House. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding me some time on this, and thank you and Subcommittee Chairman Pitts for giving me the freedom to work on this. I appreciate it very much. It has been a year since last fall's fungal meningitis outbreak associated with the tainted sterile compounded drugs from the New England Compounding Center. In my district and in our area in Virginia, we had several deaths. We had 50 confirmed cases. We had approximately 1,400 patients who were notified they could have been exposed to fungal meningitis because they received tainted steroid injections. In working on this bill, I appreciated the bipartisan manner that we used to address this and to work on this matter, particularly with my colleagues across the aisle, Representatives Gene Green and Diana DeGette, for whom I am very grateful for all of their time and effort, both by them and by their staffs. I should also thank my staff member who worked on this most, which was Adam Harbison. Having said that, in the bill, while I agree with Mr. Dingell, it is a good bill. It is not a perfect bill. But I am glad to see that language from the Griffith-Green-DeGette effort was adopted, and the FDA will be required to engage in meaningful communication with all of the states when potential problems are identified, as this has always been my priority. In my opinion, this was the biggest failure of the FDA in handling the NECC case, as they were warned about problems in advance. At least 2 states prior to this problem coming to the forefront with all of these deaths and with this horrible situation, 2 states had sent out a warning signal. The state of Colorado had said, wait a minute, we're not going to let these folks operate here. And the state of Ohio had notified the FDA that they had concerns about NECC being a manufacturer. And yet there was not any swift action taken on NECC or even an attempt to alert other states, including the state of Massachusetts, to the problems that were happening. Now, I will tell you that this bill does not change. I know there's a lot of concern out there by some in the medical community, particularly the doctors and some others. This does not change the existing law on office use, and it does not change the existing law on repackaging. There were legal questions that were involved with this situation surrounding the advertising requirements of the original bill. I was a little surprised that the FDA had waited 10 years to bring that up, but this bill fixes that problem and takes away that cloud of uncertainty as to whether or not the whole bill was not constitutional because the advertising sections were not constitutional. This is a good bill. I'm just talking about the compounding sections, but also the track and trace sections are very good. I think we are drawing a clear line defining so that the FDA can better determine who are the traditional compounding pharmacies and who are really outsourcers or manufacturers. And I think that is great, and this bill has that in there. I would be remiss if I didn't tell a story that struck me last week, because we are on that one-year anniversary. And am I out of time? Got enough 30 seconds.
I yield an additional minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
And I would say that last week I went to have lunch with my sons at their elementary school. And the elementary school secretary said to me as I was going in, she said, "I know I probably shouldn't say anything, but I want to thank you for working on this compounding bill. Doug Wingate, who died a year ago, was my family's best friend. And he and his wife were supposed to be on a cruise for their 25th anniversary, and instead we were attending their funeral. His wife last week was on that cruise with her son, but we can never bring her husband back. But this bill will make sure that we don't have that problem again, and the other Doug Wingates of the world will not have to die in order for us to change the law to make a better protected system for the American people." Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from the state of Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Almost exactly 1 year ago, as you've heard, there was a tragic meningitis outbreak in Massachusetts. 64 people lost their lives, and 750 people were sickened. In the investigation of NECC, the compounding pharmacy, there was found black specks floating in the vials. There was found fungal material. The factory itself had greenish yellow residue on supposedly sterile equipment and surfaces that tested positive for mold and bacteria. In a series of hearings in our committee, we learned that the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act of 1997 left a loophole large enough to allow large drug compounders to escape oversight by the FDA. The wording of the act also led to litigation and confusing court decisions about the FDA's authority over those manufacturers. This bill takes the first, albeit important, step to address these issues. It incorporates important pieces of bipartisan legislation, as you've heard, that I introduced with Mr. Griffith and Mr. Green. It deletes the provisions from existing law that were deemed unconstitutional by the courts. It also enhances cooperation between state boards of pharmacy and the FDA. And it gives doctors and hospitals the ability to purchase compounded drugs for their patients made in a facility that is subject to stringent FDA quality standards and oversight. Importantly, all other compounding pharmacies would continue to be subject to current law. Finally, the Drug Quality and Security Act will require, within a decade, the implementation of a nationwide system for the tracking and tracing of drugs as they move through the supply chain from manufacturer to pharmacy. I believe this will go a long way toward preventing dangerous, counterfeit, and substandard medicines from entering our drug supply. We still have work to do. We all agree with that. And I am committed to strengthening the law. May I have an additional 15 seconds?
I yield the gentlelady additional 30 seconds.
I am committed to strengthening this law so that we never have any other tragedy that Mr. Griffith discussed, where we have a Doug Wingate, who right now is missing his 25th anniversary cruise because he was killed by these tainted drugs. I'm proud to have worked with my colleagues from both sides of the aisle. I associate myself with the Chairman Emeritus' remarks that we should be able to do this on the continuing resolution and on the debt limit. And I also want to thank all of our staffs, in particular my Chief of Staff, Lisa Cohen, who spent the entire August recess. And I thank the Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, Vice Chair of both the Health and the O&I Subcommittee.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Chairman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, as an original co-sponsor and as a negotiator of the House legislation, I rise in the strongest support of the track and trace provisions which protect the public and give confidence to doctors in practice that the drugs they are dispensing in fact came from the manufacturer. In regard to the language over compounding, there is in fact much to like. There was additional work that could have been done. But unfortunately, due to the intransigent insistence of the Senate, we are considering these two issues together. 60 American lives were lost a year ago. Excellent investigative work was done by our Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, and it is disturbing to me personally that not one person at the Food and Drug Administration has been held accountable for their failure to use existing authorities or informing the state of what they knew. My test for consideration of new categories of regulation is that it must not impact the traditional practice of medicine, pharmacy, or compounding. Mr. Speaker, no bill is perfect. There's always the risk of unintended consequences. I sincerely hope that this language will pass this test, but if it does not, I hope that our committee and this body stands ready to do the necessary oversight and correct the consequences of unintended consequences. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased at this time to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I rise in strong support of the Drug Quality and Security Act. This important bill is a result of weeks of bipartisan and bicameral negotiations. I want to thank my colleagues, Representative Morgan, Griffin, and Diane DeGette, for joining me in our effort over many months. I also want to thank Chairman Upton, Ranking Member Waxman, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, Chairman Emeritus Dingell, and my good friend Congressman Matheson for all their leadership through this process and their commitment to getting this final product to the floor. It was a group effort, which is how this body should function all the time. This bill is not perfect. We heard those concerns and we have tried to address them, but the nature of compromise is not getting everything. The Energy and Commerce Committee investigated last year's outbreak and found that there was breakdowns in regulation at the state and, most concerning, on the federal level. Large operators were able to sell products interstate in unregulated gray area. In the case of the NECC, their sterile facilities are far from sterile. They operated without fear of penalties and for far too long, and people died because of that. I'm proud to say that this bill fixes the problems that led to the fungal meningitis outbreak, and it requires the FDA to succeed where it failed in the past. Bad actors concerning more with profit than with public health will not be allowed to operate with impunity again. I hope the FDA uses their enforcement discretion to maintain patient access to important drugs from nuclear pharmacy, certain repackaged drugs, and drugs for office use. While I acknowledge there are problems, it is most important that we act to protect the public health. Our constituents, when they seek care, will now have the confidence that a sterile compounded product really is sterile. We must make sure another fungal meningitis outbreak is never allowed to occur again. This bill succeeds in that goal, and I'm proud to support it, and I yield back my time.
Let me yield back. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, I'd yield 3 minutes to the Chairman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Dr. Murphy from Pennsylvania.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are here today in part to deal with the issue of the compounding pharmacies that allows the FDA to have greater oversight over interstate sales. How we got here is a tragedy. In our Oversight and Investigation Committee, we found that some 64 people died from this pain medication manufactured by the New England Compounding Center. These patients trusted that the steroids injected into their spine or their joints to relieve chronic pain was perfectly safe because of the confidence our nation's healthcare providers place in the Food and Drug Administration. That drug was contaminated with fungus and hurt people dramatically. More than 700 people receive these lethal injections. Today, most are living with unbearable horror of not knowing whether they will survive. They must spend weeks in the hospital, missing work, holidays, and time with family. They must take large doses of morphine to ease the pain. Each day is lived under the deadly threat of infection that could reach their brains and perhaps kill them. This outbreak is one of the worst public health disasters in our country's history, and a terrible tragedy and an epic failure. Sadly, during our hearings, it was pointed out that while the FDA was still having multiple visits to compounding pharmacies, they still told us they did not have the authority. Unfortunately, several years had dragged on, where the FDA heard numerous complaints about the problems with NECC. They told us it was too complex to act on it, but clearly it was not complex, nor was it a surprise. Neither NECC nor its sister company in Meridos were operating in the shadows. They were under the nose of the FDA for a decade. Field staff were aware of it. There were warning signs, alarm bells, flashing red lights, complaints from patients, nurses, pharmacists, doctors, pain clinics, hospitals, drug companies. And so the FDA told us they needed more authority. This bill will grant it to them. But I must say, in the context of this, when Dr. Hamburg told us often it was too complex, I applaud Dr. Woodcock, who told us they need to think more like physicians and less like attorneys. That is the right attitude. So with the passage of this bill, the FDA will have the authority it needs. But we have to also make sure that they have the fortitude to take action on any compounding pharmacy that they see not up to the high level of standards the FDA sets that all citizens expect. The Drug Quality and Security Act will end these problems, we hope, end these inspection holidays, and reassure the American public that these medications, wherever they are manufactured, and most by compounding pharmacies who do a superb job of maintaining sterile conditions, but in all cases the FDA will have the authority to make sure they have the inspections and they have the team that can go in there and take solid action when these centers do not adhere to those high standards. I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson.
The gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The bill before us today has two main components. We talk about the issue of the drug compounding issue and also the issue of the drug supply chain, how we can track medications through the pharmaceutical supply chain to make sure that the materials are safe and have not been subject to counterfeit medications entering that supply chain. I'd like to speak primarily about the supply chain component of the bill. That component of the bill is a product of several years of work and collaboration between a number of members on both sides of the aisle, working with, beyond members, a lot of stakeholders, the pharmaceutical supply chain stakeholders, Food and Drug Administration, and others. And this act, in part, is going to provide immediate steps to help strengthen our drug supply chain from counterfeiters and other bad actors. It also establishes a clear and defined path toward full electronic product level traceability. You know, we've seen in some recent press reports counterfeit meds can slip into our drug supply, and it's so tempting to the counterfeiters when you think that last year alone, the prescription drug market in the United States, Americans spent $325 billion on prescription meds. So this is a lucrative market, and it's very tempting for counterfeiters, and that's why it's so important we ensure the integrity of the drug supply chain. And this bill is going to work to do just that. The other thing that this bill does is it provides some needed regulatory certainty for everyone in the supply chain, establishing a national uniform standard for strengthening the integrity of the supply chain, and that's important as opposed to having each state do their own thing, because then the participants in the supply chain are going to have to do 50 different sets of rules. That doesn't make sense. And finally, the bill establishes a collaborative process between the FDA and the industry to establish protocols for taking this traceability where you can track the meds all the way down to the unit level. That's going to provide the ultimate level of security and certainty for consumers across America in the integrity of the drug supply chain. I want to thank so many people, but I particularly want to thank Chairman Upton and Ranking Member Waxman for their work on this. I also would like to thank a couple of colleagues who worked on this issue before who are no longer members of Congress, Mr. Booyer and Mr. Bilbray, who spent a lot of time in the current Congress, Congressman Latta, and Mr. Dingell as well. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would make an inquiry. We have no more further speakers on our side, so I'm ready to close, but I'll yield to the gentleman from...
We have
the gentleman from
a couple.
California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 2 minutes to our good friend from the state of Connecticut, Mr. Laurel.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I rise in opposition to the act before us. I support the track and trace provisions to prevent fake medication from entering the drug supply, and I commend the ranking member for his effort. But the voluntary approach to regulating large-scale compounding pharmacies in this bill is not strong enough to ensure the public safety in this arena. This is a life and death issue. Last year, one single compounding pharmacy in Massachusetts caused a fungal meningitis outbreak that sickened over 700 people and caused over 60 deaths, which is why I introduced legislation to draw a clear line between whether a business is a traditional compounding pharmacy or a drug manufacturer like the one in New England, and to ensure proper mandatory FDA regulation of compounding drug manufacturers shipping mass amounts of drugs across state lines. Under this bill, large-scale, high-risk compounding manufacturers would voluntarily register with the Food and Drug Administration without meaningful enough penalties for failing to comply. That New England Compounding Center, responsible for over 60 deaths, would not have to register. This voluntary approach will continue to expose patients to potentially unsafe, mass-produced compounded drugs that are not approved or evaluated by the FDA for safety, efficacy, and adequate directions for use. It is an approach that can do real harm, and it is time for the FDA to be the regulatory agency it was intended to be. At the very least, given that lives are at stake, the House should consider this issue as a standalone bill through regular order with the opportunity for amendments. It should not be on a suspension calendar. And as it is on the suspension calendar, I must oppose this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
We have no further speakers.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from
I
California.
yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
I thank the gentleman for yielding to me, and I rise in support of this compromise legislation before us today. I believe that H.R. 3204 will enable our country to further secure our pharmaceutical distribution chain and help keep patients who depend on compounding pharmacies safe. I'm proud of the Energy and Commerce Committee because concerns that many of us had about the previous version of this track and trace legislation have been taken care of in this bill. It's been addressed by this bill. And the previous bill was H.R. 1919, and we had difficulty with it. So I look forward into support of this bill. We held hearings. We are compromising on both sides. I wish Congress would take our lead on other issues and compromise, but I'm happy to support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to vote aye. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I just have myself to close.
The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of our time. I want to thank Chairman Upton and Chairman Pitt and Ranking Member Pallone, on the Democratic staff, Tiffany Guaraccio from Mr. Pallone, Greg Sunstein from Mr. Dingell, Rachel Stauffer from Mr. Gett, Lisa Cohn, Mr. Gett's office, Nate Tipton, Mr. Greens, Joel Bailey, Mr. Matheson, Karen Nelson, Eric Fromm, and Rachel Scher. All of these people played an essential role in getting this bill through. I want to single out Mr. Griffin, who introduced the bill in the House, along with Mr. Gett and Mr. Green, that served as a foundation for the compounding debate. Mr. Matheson and Mr. Latta introduced the House Track and Trace bill. Everybody didn't get what they wanted. This bill is a compromise. This institution has to reach compromises to get things done. We cannot have every issue litigated and relitigated. Once the law is settled, we must go on. And I am chagrined that we are likely to close the government because on the other side of the aisle, the leadership in this House wants to keep the fight going on the Affordable Care Act. It is the law. It has been affirmed by the courts. It's about to be put in place. We should work together to solve our country's problems, not make them worse by failing to compromise and work with each other. I yield back the balance
Gentleman
of our
yields
time.
back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of our time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this legislation that we hopefully will pass in the next few minutes is very important. It clearly, I think, would have saved the lives of those folks that were taken, and it reflects the hard work of our committee on a bipartisan basis. From the very start, the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee went to work. We got to the very bottom of a very tragic situation that impacted some 20 states, hundreds and hundreds of people. And we've changed that system now. Because of their work and their investigation, we came back and moved legislation through the proper channels, regular order, through the Health Subcommittee and through our committee, and worked very closely with Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to craft this bill that would have stopped this awful thing that happened a year ago. Congress does work and can work when we work together. And I'm proud of this product. I'm proud of this legislation. I would urge the Senate to take it up in the next day or two so that we, in fact, can get it to the President's desk. And I thank every member who worked so hard. And we saw today the personal impact certainly on all of our districts, but the members themselves who many of us, in fact, did know folks directly impacted not only through death, but also those that were impacted because of the impact on their own lives as they still try to recuperate and survive. So I would urge all my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 3204? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Good work.